So the Russian military keeps getting caught in the same lie, and they're being called out by their own supporters, with one analyst saying, quote, "This information is not just inaccurate, but it doesn't even remotely correspond to the actual situation on the ground," end quote. I mean, you can imagine the confusion of a Russian soldier being hunted down in Kupyansk by Ukrainian forces to have heard yesterday that actually Russia controls the entire city, always has. I mean, we have footage of Ukrainian units operating in Kupyansk in recent days, so this doubling down by Russia is odd, but might not be unique. In fact, some Russian sources are now openly fretting that this same situation is playing out further south in Konstantinivka. So yesterday, the Russian Ministry of Defense held an on-camera briefing where the defense minister asked the commander of the West Group of Forces for an update on Kupyansk. The defense minister here said, quote, "Generally speaking, I see that Kupyansk is currently being mopped up, isn't it?" To which the general responded, and this is from the Ministry of Defense website, General Colonel Sergei Kuzovlev reported that all districts of the city are under the control of the Russian troops, despite the enemy's unsuccessful attempts to break into Kupyansk. That just wasn't going to fly with the Russian mill bloggers that are actually in touch with Russian soldiers engaged in the Kupyansk operation. One of them, Romanov, said, quote, "This information is not just inaccurate, but it doesn't even remotely correspond to the actual situation on the ground. Moreover, in fact, Kupyansk was not under our control for a single day. The command of the Western Group is simply coloring in territories for fake reports. The consequences of false reports, the lack of sufficient countermeasures against the enemy's ongoing offensive in the area, and as a result, the enemy occupying areas previously controlled by us." Now, as a quick refresher on what we're looking at here, I'll go to the map, and we're going to look at two different maps today to show you the difference in reporting. Starting here with Deep State map, and I'm going to go back to, again, the reason I like Deep State map here is you've got the dates. So you can see the change in territorial control. So we're going to go up here. I was way too far zoomed in there. So we're going to go up here to Kupyansk in the northeastern portion of Ukraine. This is what the situation in Kupyansk looked like on or about November 1st. So this was about the extent of Russian territorial control. You see them pushing in from the north down into Kupyansk. Now, around this time in November, the first or second week of November, we can bounce around here a little bit, not a lot of changes, Vladimir Putin strangely went on air and publicly talked about the tactical situation at the front. He doesn't often do that, but in this case, he chose to, and he chose to horribly incorrectly. Like in this case, he said Russian forces have taken all of Kupyansk. He invited international reporters to come in and see for themselves, and you're hearing it from Russian mill bloggers. They didn't control it then. They hadn't controlled it previously. I mean, it's been an ongoing fight for quite a while now. So shortly thereafter, Ukraine kicked off this localized counterattack run through the 13th Hartia Brigade and started pushing Russian forces out of Kupyansk. So this is what the situation moving from, about peak Russian advances to today. All right, so we've got a couple pockets here. This is the Ukrainian sourced reporting, generally speaking, on Deep State map. And you'll see that most of Kupyansk is either controlled by Ukraine, is a gray zone being contested by the two sides, and then there's a couple pockets of Russian control in the city. This is, the Ukrainian source map. I want to show you the difference here when looking at a map. This is Suryak map, tends to be more in line with the Russian Ministry of Defense claims. So if you look at how they are reporting in Kupyansk, it actually lines up more with the briefing that the MOD just gave, right? So you see they have Russian control over the northern portion of the city, entirely here to the northeast. By comparison, all of that on Deep State map is either under Ukrainian control or gray zone. So that's essentially what we're looking at right now. But the mill bloggers, again, were livid with the Russian government continuing to double down, saying they control this territory. Two Majors says, quote, "From the Kupyansk direction, the frontline soldiers strongly grumbled about the beautiful reports of the commander of the Western Group of Forces, not agreeing with the reported situation in Kupyansk and regarding the liberated villages. Military informant jokingly said, if you're going to make a mistake, you may as well make it to the end. Or, if you're going to lie, you're going to have to die with that lie." Belarusian Silovic said, quote, "In Kupyansk itself, there are still Russian groups cut off from the main forces. The most difficult thing in this situation is supply. It's somewhat organized, but overall, the situation in the city remains quite challenging." And Again, I want to stress we're going to be playing footage in today's video of Ukrainian forces operating in Kupyansk. And much of this is being shared across Russian channels, with the Russian channels saying, what's happening here? This isn't good. We thought that this was completely under our control. So there's a big lie being uncovered here in an area that is not necessarily strategically significant. But I think it points to something bigger, and we're going to get to that here in a second. So even Russian media Rybar says, quote, in the Kupyansk direction, the situation remains complex. Contrary to official statements, the concentration of enemy forces continues to grow in Kupyansk, and UAV operators and artillery of the West troops are working on credit-freed settlements. So a key term there is Russia refers to areas in here. We'll jump back to November while we're kind of zoomed in. These areas that they previously had taken. So we'll take this northern area of Kupyansk, as this is under Russian control, or at least reported up through the Russian chain of command. Now moving to today, they have to clear that area. They're referring to those as territories taken on credit. They never actually had it. They were kind of, put it on the credit card, right? The Russian MOD credit card. So they're having to pay for it now, is the other side of that. So Rybar actually went into the current situation in Kupyansk, where they said, quote, the situation remains complex with the enemy bringing in new units into the city. Fierce clashes continue on the bridgehead, and the number of destroyed Ukrainian equipment is growing on systematically targeted crossings. Footage continues to appear online showing Ukrainian formations present on positions north of the city. They say Russian armed forces' sporadic defense is mainly maintained on the northern and northeastern outskirts of the city. In the central part, the concentration of enemy forces is gradually increasing, so Ukrainian forces gradually increasing in the city center, judging by the appearance of communication antennas. They say Russian 203mm artillery continues to work on areas freed on credit on January 4th, so those false reports continue. They say the battles continue to be extremely heavy and fierce. The enemy has not yet exhausted its reserves and continues to bring forces both into the city and to the left bank in general. And one interesting note here is they said the Russian Rubicon group has started operating in Kupyansk. This is kind of the, if you look at the Ukrainian unmanned systems forces, it's kind of the Russian response to that. So it's a dedicated drone unit. All things considered, it is probably the most elite Russian drone unit. This is a group that has done pretty significant and deadly work down in Pokrovsk. They were heavily involved when the counteroffensive started in Kursk to push Ukrainian forces out of that territory of Russia. The top equipment, the best operators, the most money goes to Rubicon. And it sounds like right now Rubicon is, if not beginning, at least expanding operations in the Kupyansk direction. Now, all of this brings about, again, the big question of what's happening here and why. Now, we have seen seen every military around the world lie, right? Russia's had some great ones so far, talking about who knows how many hundreds of different HIMARS systems have been destroyed. More equipment has been destroyed than Ukraine has ever possessed, that kind of stuff, no doubt. It's hard to prove that, right? I mean, I guess technically, if you say you destroyed more F-16s than have been produced, something like that, it's going to be easy to prove. The territorial control is not one where we've seen this level of lying and doubling down by the MOD in quite a while, and certainly not seen this amount of pushback from the pro-Russia crowd talking to soldiers on the ground saying, what the hell are you guys doing? This is costing us lives. This is costing us equipment. I'm knocking things over on my desk. This is unique. Now, there's a couple different ways to look at this. First off is, why is this happening in the first place? And then why is Russia continuing to kind of push this, knowing this lie that they're being called out on? So the reason it happens in the first place is every offensive action is kind of required to have some sort of result. So if you're a Russian commander all the way down the chain of command, if you're going to send 5 of your soldiers forward, you want to report something accomplished, right? You took a block, you took a house, you took a building, you took a city, whatever it might be. You certainly don't want to have to report up that those 5 guys you sent forward died and nothing changed. So you see these small exaggerations of they took an extra 50 meters, they took over that house on the corner, whatever it might be. But the problem then becomes when you make that up, or let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say they actually do take that house on the corner. It just happens that a few hours later, they're hit with a Ukrainian drone and killed. So that report went up, saying that Russia controls that house on the corner. They start coloring in the maps, and that makes its way all the way up to the Ministry of Defense. But down on the ground, they do not control that house because the soldiers that were there are now dead. So the next group that moves in has to still fight for that territory that supposedly Russia controls. Well, rather than report up that initial report was inaccurate or the situation has changed, it seems like up the Russian chain of command, they can only advance. So at some point, you reach a breaking point there, and that's what happened in Kupyansk, where the Russian military at the higher levels thought the entire city was taken, that Ukraine was not capable of pushing back, so a couple of key things happened. They stopped providing artillery, air, and drone support in areas where the fighting was heavy, because they would look at a map and say, we're not going to carry out artillery strikes or air strikes in territory that we control, maybe at the front, but not in territory we control. That would require somebody admitting that they actually did not control those big chunks inside of Ukraine. The other part there is any sort of reinforcements. If you're constantly reporting up success, but your people are actually dying, when you turn to your commander and say, I need more men, I need more artillery, I need more ammunition, he goes, why? I thought you had taken that entire city or that block or that building or whatever it might be. These lies compounded over time, and Ukraine took advantage of that in Kupyansk. The other side of this, however, is why is the Russian government continuing to articulate this? Again, Kupyansk is not necessarily a strategically significant town, all things considered. So why here? Why now? Why are they doubling down? And I think what we're seeing, there's a lot of different ways you can get into this. I think what we're seeing right here is really just people not wanting to own any bad news as it makes its way up the chain of command. So there's some place where this stops, whether it's all the way down to the platoon commander, all the way up to Putin. Somewhere in there, a Russian officer is seeing this report, knows that it is not accurate, and is passing it along anyways. Somewhere. And whether the people above him then knowingly pass that along, knowingly pass false information, or maybe they just kind of are blinded, they don't want to dig into it further, whatever it might be, that's kind of the core here, is bad information might lead to job insecurity. So now you have, again, at some level, whether it's Putin, the Ministry of Defense, or further down, someone in the Russian chain of command is making battlefield decisions based off of a false reality. Kupyansk is a great example. They thought they had it. They think they still have it. The chain of command is broken, and you cannot execute a war long-term like that. That doesn't mean the Russian government, the Russian military is going to fall apart this week, this month, this year, anything like that, but it significantly hampers their ability to carry out current and future operations when orders from the top do not align with the reality on the ground. Again, to go as simple as providing air support for this area. At some place up the chain of command, it's going to be stopped because they're going to say, that must be wrong. We're not going to carry out an airstrike on our own guys. You see how that spirals into one thing, the next. It's not sustainable long term. But here's the thing. It might not just be happening in Kupyansk. This might actually be something that's happening in other areas of the front as well. But before getting to that, we've got a quick fundraiser update here. We just got some footage, a picture actually, from Ukraine Aid Operations, a campaign we did a little while ago. They were able to provide 5 Matrice 30T drones, so thermal drones. These are big ones. 25 high-end tablets and phones, and approximately $12,000 worth of items for the drone school for the 413th Regiment Unmanned Systems Forces raid. So we've actually talked to their commander, did an interview a little while ago, but here's a quick thank you to all of you from the 413th.
Ми дякуємо організації United Air and Logistics, а також Сітки Дебоєв, Юрію Ткаченку та Престону Стюарту за 10 смартфонів та 15 планшетів, які працюватимуть у бойових екіпажах та допомагатимуть моніторити стан і пересування особового складу, а також використовуватися в льотних місіях.
All right, so I mentioned that this false reporting, taking areas on credit, might not just be an issue in Kupyansk. It might be more widespread across the Russian military. And Rybar just yesterday kind of sounded the alarm that Konstantinivka, a little bit further south here, may very well be experiencing the same thing. So here we have it on a deep state map. This is going to be another one where we're going to see a clear difference between the Ukrainian and the Russian reporting. So in Rybar, Russian media, they said, in the Konstantinivka direction, a situation is brewing that may become a bigger problem than Kupyansk, as in false reports opening the door for a Ukrainian counterattack, or at the very least embarrassing Russia by saying they have a lot more territory than they do. They say recently an offensive began on the southern flank of the city on the Klebenbik Reservoir. The Russian armed forces relatively successfully advanced on several sectors, claims of full control over the northern bank are extremely premature. So zooming in here, this is the reservoir they're talking about. And according to Deep State map, you can see that the northern bank of the reservoir is listed as the gray zone. So still being contested. If we go over to Suryak, that lines up much more based off of the Russian Ministry of Defense claims, and we come down here to Konstantinivka, got to zoom out and zoom back in to get all the way down here, and we go down to this reservoir in the south, you'll see that they have the entire thing marked as being under Russian control. In fact, not just the northern bank of the reservoir, but quite a bit of territory beyond that. Again, to go back and forth here, Deep State has all of this contested. Suryak, from the Russian Ministry of Defense, has all of this already taken. So Rybar says the problem is also north of Konstantinivka. There's a significant credit ledger of all of the settlements recently declared as liberated. Maisky was relatively recently finally taken, and that was after more than 3 months since the official announcement. So shifting up here a little bit north, Maisky here, this territory, they say it was just liberated, just taken within the last couple weeks here, but it was 3 months since the official announcement. So what they're calling out is in this general direction, the forces fighting around Konstantinivka, you're still seeing the exaggerated claims of Russian advances. Rybar continued by saying the volunteer corps units have been supplied on a residual basis for a long time and are successfully advancing almost miraculously, but not on the scale reported. Throughout the special military operation, there have been examples of successful psyops that required exaggerating one's own successes. Whether there is any sense in this now is a big question. He says, and we really hope that the attacks south of Konstantinivka were not activated because the northern encirclement had already been formed, since it only exists on paper. And this is, again, getting into what this means big picture. They're suggesting that the reason this pocket, there might be pushing down here in Konstantinivka, is because the reports up at the Ministry of Defense are that the northern sector has had such success coming in from Kupyansk. As in, this is taken care of. We're closing that off, so go ahead and begin pushing from the south. The possibility being that Russian reinforcements were moved from Kupyansk down to Konstantinivka, where, again, according to Rybar, false reports are still being made. Again, this is not something that's going to change the dynamic of the war in a matter of days or weeks. It very well might open the door for Ukraine to carry out successful localized counterattacks. But big picture, long term, this type of false reporting and operating off of false reports is just not sustainable to really any military in a contested conflict like this. Now, turning to another sector, we've got some new footage coming out that I'll play here from Khartia, up in the Kharkiv direction, where they say the Charter Brigade, part of the 2nd Corps of the National Guard, repelled an attempt by Russian forces to launch an assault and destroyed about 70 Russian occupiers. They say over the course of the last week, Russian occupation forces attempted to launch an assault in the area of responsibility of the Charter Brigade north of Kharkiv. Thanks to the coordinated action of these soldiers, infantrymen, UAV operators, and artillerymen, the attempt failed. Relatively unique right now to see 70 soldiers, dismounted soldiers, moving across relatively open terrain and clearly being spotted a long distance out, and it doesn't look like Ukraine had any issue in hunting these guys down and eliminating them. In fact, there was a recent article, take this with a grain of salt, but based off of the footage you're seeing, it's not completely out of line, that the losses in the last few months have been 27-1 in favor of Ukraine. And it makes sense. I mean, you see the Ukrainian operations, they're small assault groups moving into contested territory to hunt down Russians that are, holed up in basements. But day after day after day after day, we are watching 1, 2, 3, 5, or in that case, 70 Russian soldiers move across open terrain, getting hit, at the very least wounded, if not killed, by Ukrainian drones. It would not be 27-1 is a staggering number, by the way. That is really, really, really high. But for Ukraine to stay in the fight effectively the way they are, that's kind of where they need to be. And again, based off of the footage that is coming out, both on Russian and Ukrainian channels, I don't think that's all that much of a long shot, at least here in the last couple weeks. So turning back to the map here, we do have a couple Russian advances worth talking about, somewhat notable here. The first one in the Slovyansk direction between Seversk and Slovyansk, Zakitny here, right here on the riverbank. We'll go ahead and play this clip of the Russian flag raising there. But the reason this is notable here is there's just not a lot of room for Ukraine to give up much movement at all to the east of Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. We've talked recently about the limited ability for Ukraine to keep those areas resupplied. And I mean, every kilometer really matters in Russia's ability to effectively target Ukraine's logistics moving into those sectors and keeping Ukrainian units supplied. So a bit of a movement there from Russia west of Seversk that did fall to Russia a little over a month ago. And then further west, there's another one here, kind of give you an idea. We've not been talking a lot about the Zaporizhia direction, but there was an advance here to the north of Huliopoli, Priluki, listed here as a gray zone on the deep state map. But Russia published this footage here saying units of the East Group of Forces have taken control of the populated point of Priluki. They say guardsmen of the 394th Motor Rifle Regiment of the 127th Motor Rifle Regiment penetrated up to 2.5 kilometers into enemy's defenses on the western bank of the Gaicha River. They say as a result of the coordinated action, a major defensive node with an area of up to 15 square kilometers was taken under control. Up to 2 platoons of enemy forces, Ukrainian forces, from the 225th Separate Motor Rifle Battalion, 5 pickup trucks, 1 armored personnel carrier, and 1 tank were destroyed. Again, we have some footage coming from Russia showing this operation playing out. I don't think I've seen enough to verify 5 pickup trucks, an APC, a tank, and 2 full platoons of Ukrainian forces. But nonetheless, it does look like Russia was able to advance in this specific area of Zaporizhia here in just the last couple days. But that's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.